Hey, friends. So, yesterday, as I've continued to listen to The Scandal of God, which I've talked about now for several days, there was a very simple and almost kind of obvious statement that Alan made, Alan Jones being the author of The Scandal of God, of the as yet unreleased Scandal of God, but coming soon. Alan makes a point that again struck me as kind of like, duh, I've probably said this any number of times in my description of his work or in just talking about his ideas. But somehow it hit home for me. This is really the core of things. Because what he said is we need to, I'm paraphrasing, but he basically said we need to make room in our thinking and our beliefs, whether our beliefs are religious or scientific or atheistic. We need to make room for doubt. And because doubt is the willingness to accept that we don't know and that we ultimately can't know. It's the humbling, it's like couching all of human knowledge in a context of infinite unknowability, and it's acknowledging what human knowledge even is. You know, Alan he's very articulate, and he quotes a number of really beautiful thinkers who describe the various ways in which scientific knowledge, which many of us, I think this is less and less the case in this contemporary age, but it is still our sort of early modernistic presumption that scientific knowledge is hard knowledge. Scientific knowledge is really, really true. Whereas religious or theological or spiritual knowledge is kind of fuzzy, and everybody should be able to have their own religious way of seeing things, and we don't want to tell anybody they're wrong about what they believe spiritually, even though I might secretly think they're an idiot. But I'm not going to say that. I'm going to say, well, to each his own. But subconsciously, I just regard the entire domain of spiritual knowledge as being one that's kind of floofy, non-scientific. To which Alan would respond, exactly, it's metaphorical. And there's as much meaning to be derived from a metaphorical domain as there is from a scientific domain. But what's so fantastic about both what Alan is exploring and also what many of the thinkers that he is referencing have kind of are pointing at is that scientific knowledge also isn't hard knowledge. It's a set of workable formula and data and systems of organizing data and using data, implementing data, that work in a context, but that are ultimately in some ways still fluid, and ultimately, dealing with a kind of specific dimension of reality that if we really get serious about it, if we really go deep, requires a deep willingness to be in doubt. I mean, if you accepted Copernican astronomy, and then Galileo comes along, and then, or if you accepted Newtonian physics, and then Einstein comes along, there has to, why did we need Einstein if what Newton said was true? Why did we need another version of how the physical universe works? Shouldn't we have kind of gotten that part? And so what science is doing, just like what spirituality is doing, is mapping and very rigorously capturing observations that fall within the realm of our capacity to perceive, and our capacity to perceive is continually being extended through technological instruments. We can map the universe differently now than we could before. We could point something at the sky and see a galaxy millions of light years away like it's right there in front of us. Different. We can perceive more, so more gets organized. There's an increasingly kind of expanding view of the world that's being organized into observable and definable patterns. That's science. But the limits to that and the context of that are constantly changing, and doubt plays as much a role as it does in religious or theological contemplation and pursuit. But I think this takes me to a sense of a distinction that Ken Wilber makes, which is there is a realm of the interior. He calls it interiority, which can be explored and in many ways investigated using the scientific method. In other words, using hypothesis, experiment, verification of hypothesis, or refutation of hypothesis, in the same way that the exterior domain is currently being mapped by science. And if we accept that, if we actually will lend credence to the notion of the interiority as a domain of reality, then the processes that we're using to investigate the exterior and the interior can begin to cross-pollinate each other. They can begin to work in harmony, to work in concert. We can learn things in the exterior that apply to the interior. We can learn things in the interior that apply to the exterior. We can learn what the connections are between the interior and the exterior. What is my internal experience of a thought or a vision or an image? Some scientists could hook a bunch of electrodes to my head and show me what portion of my brain is lighting up as I think about a certain image. Now, they might, even if they got really good at this, they could describe all the neurons that are firing in my brain as I think about a certain image. And as I maybe have associated feelings with that image. They could be like, oh, this is what right here, this part of your brain is going crazy when you do that. And which is amazing. And that's an incredible, that gives us whole new capacities as a species. That level of investigation gives us entirely new capacities as a species, technological, medical, ultimately as an outgrowth of those things, social and political realities and possibilities we're living in a pretty incredible time on Earth. And at the same time, mapping the neurons in my brain and showing me what they're doing is not the same thing as my interior conscious experience of that thing. If I listen to a Mozart symphony and somebody maps my brainwaves, and then I go to a lecture and for 3 hours they show me what my brain did while I was listening to a Mozart symphony. This is the exterior, right? The brain is a material. It's an exterior material thing with electrochemical activity going on. Somebody shows me this is your brain on a Mozart symphony. Is that the same thing as the experience of the symphony? Or am I to accept that my internal experience of the symphony, which was a 30-minute spiritual experience, that was just an illusion, that I shouldn't pay too much attention to that, because really that's just a byproduct of this brain mapping that's going on. That to me is a patently absurd notion. It's so blindly privileging the exterior over the interior. And as you can probably tell from the way I'm kind of describing this, there's no conversation to be had from that place. If someone's willing to say an entire domain of human existence, in other words, the conscious, the interiority of consciousness is not a real thing, it's a byproduct of exterior blah, 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 then you can also see why someone would say religion, spirituality, none of that matters, because what we have is science to map the exterior domain. That's what really matters, because this domain doesn't even matter. So all these investigative tools, all these processes and technologies that are designed to map the interior, well, they don't mean anything. They can't mean anything, because that domain isn't real. It's not a legitimate domain of inquiry. I call that crazy, but some people would say that's totally sane. Some people would say that's what it, that's facing up to reality. That's facing up to the way the world really is. And ultimately, what we're talking about, of course, is materialism. It's a very simple and ubiquitous phenomenon. But I really resonate with thinkers like Sadhguru, who would say yoga is the science of conscious evolution. It is a science. It is as rigorous. It is as detailed. It is as excruciatingly. There's a rigor and a kind of discipline to it that is as powerful as the rigor that we apply to science in the external domain. So, back to I seem to be clearly listening to a preacher is making me have the impulse to preach. So that's interesting to note. But there's just a sense I have of this making room for doubt as a kind of outgoing bedrock starting point for the conversation. Because have you ever had have you ever talked to people? Of course you have. You've ever had conversations with people where you know that they're not really listening. They don't really want to change their perspective. They just want to tell you their perspective, ideally convince you of their perspective, because if you'll just capitulate and say, yes, you're right, then their own affirmation of their way of seeing things sort of gets to dig down into itself and gets to be a little more stable. No fun to have that conversation, because there's you know from the first couple of sentences that you start exchanging, oh, this isn't going to actually go anywhere. We're not actually going to discover anything. We're just going to affirm each other's / our own already existing convictions. And to me, that's utterly boring. Why would I want to do that? If I'm not going to be evolved, if I'm not going to learn anything, if nothing is going to change about the way that I see things, then why would I have a conversation? What's the point? To convince myself that I'm right? That doesn't really feel very compelling. But whereas on the other hand, when you enter a conversation and you can tell there's a probing, like even as we speak our beliefs, it's almost like we're bouncing them off the exterior wall of another person's perspective or the context of a group in order to find out, how does this land? This is what I'm thinking. What happens when I say it out loud? What happens to my own beliefs in dialogue? And what do I receive in response? And what is the upshot of all that? What does that culminate in some kind of new revelation? And the sort of like very obvious but easy to overlook foundation of all that is doubt, a willingness to be in doubt. Doubt is the antidote to fundamentalism of all kinds. And, this is, again, kind of an obvious thing, but it feels like it's landing with me in a deeper way now as a result of this, of reading this book. So, yeah, if you can't tell, these posts are getting long. So, thanks for sticking with me. Appreciate you. Have a great day. Much love. I'll see you soon.